I'm letting them in. Slideshow mode.
Went to all college when we were young. At that time, children could not dance. Only people over 50 years of age could dance. Most people do not know this, that the government forbid children to dance Indian. And that was so they could wipe off the culture of the young people. And then finally, the new generation would never know what happened, never know what happened.
My relation. Let go of your fears. For now is the time to take courage. My relation, look. For this is a beautiful life. Beauty is everywhere. You are here today, my relation. And nothing is more beautiful than that.
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Viviani, we can't see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Give me just one moment. Fix this.
At that
Hi there, everybody. Good to see you. Looks like we're having a little tech difficulty here, but we will get started in just a second. And even though, that video, the dance sound was struggling, it still was beautiful to watch him dance. You can still see the motion. So, and you all will get the link to that. You can play it at your own leisure at another time, but it's good to see everybody. See our friends from North Dakota, LA. Oklahoma.
All right, next slide, Deviani. There you go. Take it away, Emily.
Good afternoon, everyone. Some of you have already started to do so, but we're building a community here, and please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, share where you're joining us from. We are being recorded. A copy of the recording will be distributed to everyone. And next slide. So we are also offering continuing education units. I am going to share a link now and will throughout the hour. You have, in order to receive units in either nursing, medical, or social work credits, you need to attend the hour and complete our survey. You can also get continuing education units if you watch the recording later. Next slide. And yes, as I said, we're offering continuing education. This is in collaboration with Cardia. If you have any questions, please reach out to Paige O'Sullivan or reach out to any USET staff and we can pass along your questions. Next slide. And there are no relevant financial disclosures to disclose. Next, okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, all my relations. I'm Bernice UP Jordan. I am a citizen of the Fort Peck Nation. I'm a public health program coordinator for USET. Next slide. Next slide. So I want to learn and acknowledge what tribal nation land you were on, any organization you're standing on. All you would have to do is go to this website or text your zip code to this number and it will let you know. Next slide. So we are reclaiming a behavioral health community. We have been growing since January 2002. I know it's been a little while, and thanks for all of you that have been continuing on this endeavor with us. If you can take a look at the map, and that little dot represents a collective, person, not just one person, but it's a collective amount of people that are assigned to that region. Next slide. Next slide. And I want to introduce Holly Echo Hawk. She's going to go ahead and start this presentation on responding and moving past tribal community crisis. All right, it's all on you now, Holly.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. New Mexico, South Dakota, Oregon, New York, hey there, Colorado, Mississippi, Missouri, Utah, Washington, Michigan, Virginia, and the other states I mentioned before. Good to see you today. Glad you're here. So today we're going to talk about crisis. And I'm going to tell you some stories about why I thought this was an important topic for today. So the title, Responding and Moving Past Tribal Community Crisis. Next slide. So we have the learning objectives that you all saw in the information sent to you before, but we're going to talk about, we always talk about brilliance, of course, and how our innate native psychological brilliance plays or can play a role in relationship to crisis resolution. We know that community crisis can overwhelm a human's coping mechanism. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about some steps in training and deploying crisis teams that support traditional ceremony and healing, and I'm going to share some information with you about the importance of community crisis rehearsals. So the next slide. So any kind of crisis in communities certainly can overwhelm an individual or a group or a community's coping mechanisms. And now today, with all the crisis that's going on in other parts of the world, I know we all feel that. I have to actually limit keeping my television on news, because that's my way of trying to protect myself and not get overwhelmed with what's happening. So there's no shortage of crises, that's for sure. So the next slide. So where this came from in my mind and why I want to talk about this today is last month, a couple of months ago, end of August, the National Tribal Opiate Summit was held in Washington State, sponsored by the Northwest Portland Area Health Board and many tribes in the Pacific Northwest. The Tulalip tribe opened their facilities to support this. There was over 1,000 Native people from everywhere in the country that were there. So in the summit for those 3 days, common themes that you heard about, and it was sort of an open forum design, very common themes that we heard repeatedly every day and over those 3 days was about crisis, ongoing community crisis in tribal communities. There was also a lot of conversation about the state of emergency declarations. And you all know from your locations that you're working from, it's becoming more and more common that tribes are declaring a state of emergency. So there was a lot of discussion about that in this summit. So the next slide. So here's what my concern was, and I've heard this concern from some other folks as well, is when a tribe declares a state of emergency, that happens when they're at the peak of their stress, and maybe not the peak, but they are very, very stressed out. Something has happened. It could be a natural disaster. It could be suicide clusters. It could be overdoses. But something has happened that is so intense that the tribal leaders and tribal council, sometimes tribal health boards, they get to the point they don't know what to do next almost, and they declare a state of emergency. So when they do that, I always think about those tribal leaders. They too are in feeling that emergency. They too have families that are impacted and involved. So they have to try to, push through that and think clearly, and they declare a state of emergency. The reason they do that is to draw attention to the alarm, that's sound the alarm of what's going on in their community, and to as a way of getting additional resources and sometimes additional funding additional support brought into their community to help. But my question is always about the what next. So state of emergencies are becoming common, sadly, in tribal communities, but what next? What happens after the state of emergency is declared? And are Native communities ready? Are they response ready for mass community trauma? Because that's really what happens in tribal communities. It affects everyone. So the what next for some communities is increasing their police and connection with conventional first responders. That's what in some tribal communities, that's what it means. But many other tribal communities are becoming more experienced in mass community trauma response. To the next slide. So one of the, in California, one of the natural disasters that's caused so many um, emergencies, state of emergencies to be declared is the wildfires. And the wildfires have really torn through too many tribal communities in California, which is where I'm sitting right now. And when those fires, the firestorms come incredibly intense, incredibly fast moving, burning everything in sight, people fleeing, as you all have seen on television. And some tribal communities have lost nearly, half of all their housing. Not just housing, think about it. They've lost their traditional artifacts. They've lost 100-year-old baskets have burned up. They've lost their regalia. They've lost one health clinic a couple of years ago, tribal health clinic in Northern California, was part of the fire that burned the entire town down, including their health clinic. Incredible duress and anxiety, and the staff at the behavioral health, in the behavioral health field, and the tribal health clinics, and all of the service providers are, to say that they're overwhelmed is an understatement, but they're still standing there, doing their job the best that they can. So lots of natural disasters, as well as our sadly overdose has created many states of emergency. I'm at a meeting now. There are some people saying that they've been to a funeral every week. It's becoming normalized, which is really terrible, really sad. So the next slide. So as I said in the beginning, in some communities, previously, especially years past, the crisis system was sort of unofficially handed over to law enforcement, tribal police or local non-tribal police. And we know that there's too many examples that law enforcement is not necessarily always the best in de-escalation and handling a crisis situation in a way that de-escalates. And sometimes there's some horribly devastating examples that come out of that. That doesn't mean that law enforcement is terrible or bad necessarily across the board. It just means that they're not equipped to handle especially behavioral health crisis. Next slide. So SAMHSA, you may be familiar with this. I think I listed it as a resource at the end, but a year ago, SAMHSA developed or published their behavioral health crisis care guide. And it talks about developing a comprehensive crisis networks of first line of defense to prevent further tragedies. And they emphasize that to be effective in crisis service systems, it's all about relationships. It's all about ways to be human, to be compassionate. But I remember and think about the crisis responders. They live in those communities too. They're the amount of stress that they're under is just unbelievable. But they're there any crisis care is there to help and to provide hope and healing and to save lives. Next slide. The great thing about crisis care, and some of you may be working in crisis care, we started doing quite a bit of work in California on mobile crisis response. So we're pretty immersed in crisis care work right now. But the great thing about crisis care, universal crisis care, is it really is the most fundamental basic element of mental health care because it's immediate, it's unconditional, and it accepts anyone seeking care. There's no checking your insurance card before you receive some support from a crisis responder. So that's the great news about it. It's real-time access to response that aligns with the needs of that person when that person or community needs it most. So it really is the ultimate universal care. The next slide. A little bit more about the crisis care guide. So crisis care, you all probably know, crisis response has shifted. And today, it really operates under kind of a mantra of crisis services are for anyone, anywhere, anytime. You're in a crisis or your community, but basically if a person's in crisis, no matter where they're at, if they're at a casino bathroom, if they're at a buddy's house, if they're out somewhere in a car pulled off the side of the road, crisis services, anyone, anywhere, anytime. That's what the goal is those crisis responders to get there. And from a behavioral health perspective, they're there to provide support to de-escalate and to help that person avoid unnecessary law enforcement involvement and to reduce hospital emergency room use. The other thing that's shifted with crisis care that's I'm pretty happy about is that peer teams are matched up with a mental health professional in crisis response. And it's a community-based crisis response now. And there's funding to support community-based crisis response. It's somewhat linked to the movement in the 988 crisis lines. And Medicaid is starting to fund mobile crisis response, community-driven, peer members matched with mental health professionals. So if there's a crisis and someone calls a 988 number in California, which is kind of what I'm focused on right now, they can, as of next year, a mobile crisis team will respond, not the police, not a fire truck, but a mobile crisis team, which could be a peer and a mental health professional. So the next slide is there's a lot of work going on in California now about establishing the protocol of mobile crisis response. We're working, we meaning Kaufman and Associates, which is a tribal training and technical assistance organization, is working with the state of California contractors on making sure that the response protocols are native aware. And so lots of emphasis on mobile crisis teams, which is really great. I was hearing yesterday in a tribal meeting I'm at, they were saying that, Indian country really needs tribal crisis intervention teams. We need tribal people in teams, in communities, on the streets, to respond to Native people in crisis. That actually happens naturally. There's a lot of people that they're sort of unofficial crisis responders. You probably have them in your communities too. They're doing it out of their goodwill. They're not necessarily being paid for it, but they're known, respected people in the community that will respond to a crisis. I think those people should be supported with the gas money, support it with vehicles, support it with training, support it with, we are important people. And when Native people are in crisis, they should have, excellent crisis care and fully supported crisis care. So the next slide is standard crisis care standards. So good crisis care, maybe some of you are working in the crisis field, and if you are, congratulations, good for you. It's incredible work. I'm not a crisis responder. I work closely with many crisis responders, and I know from them what it's like to be a crisis care responder. So good crisis care, definitely effective strategy for suicide prevention. We work hard to make sure that the new crisis response standards really align with the unique needs and culture of Native people and other minority groups. That definitely crisis response, it reduces psychiatric hospital bed overuse. Definitely helps stop the drain on unnecessary law enforcement going into communities and they're, draining their resources. And it can be very crucial to reducing fragmentation of mental health care. Crisis care responders, community-based crisis care responders are very trained in, and we encourage them to know that community. If they're in a county, for example, if they're county-based, who's the tribal people in that county? What are the county resources, tribal resources? They have to really know those communities to help reduce the fragmentation of mental health care. If they de-escalate someone and they need further care, they also provide warm handoffs. But that means they have to know that community. They have to know those resources. They have to know who to call at all hours to help that person transition into longer term care if they need. The next slide is, so all of this about crisis care, the SAMHSA guide, all of that's fantastic. But to me, I'm always thinking, so what's not right about it? What's off? What's off kilter with this great information and the great emphasis on mobile crisis care? So the next slide, I'll tell you what my thinking is on why. What's off? So what's off to me is standard conventional crisis care is individual focused. It's focused on an individual person in crisis. But tribal community crisis has a completely different context and a different history about what led to the crisis and how they respond to a crisis responder coming to them. They have tribal communities are different because it's not individual focus. Plus, we want crisis responders to realize that, we always say, right, Native people are brilliant. Today I'm wearing my Genius shirt. And that they may be in crisis, but they have an inherent strategic thinking. They have extensive family networks. The tribal community has very rapid, as you all know, communication pathways that can help. And of course, that's not goes without saying, the cultural strengths that tribal communities have are immense in most, if not all, tribal communities. So to me, what's off kilter with all the crisis response work that is in action right now, which is fantastic because it's trying to not overuse unnecessary law enforcement and unnecessary hospitalization. What's off kilter for me, it's individual focus. All crisis response training, and I'm talking about conventional crisis response, is very individual focused. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I think it's all about mass trauma for Native people, many Native situations, not all, but many. Mass trauma is, generic definition is large number of people affected by natural disaster or man-made trauma events, and they have a shared experience of trauma and traumatic loss. That sounds like tribal communities, right? And then some disasters, in this example from the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, they refer to it as terrorism. Tribal communities, some disasters like the opiate crisis, fentanyl, xylazine, that continue over a long period of time and create ongoing insecurity and exposure of danger or threat of danger, making it really difficult for Native people to function normally in their community because they're always wondering what next. I was listening to a story yesterday of a Native community in the remote, but in the country, not in a different planet, but remote, and the crisis that they have. And whether it's in the example, because I'm at a meeting about substance use, overdose or shootings, and they call the police or someone to come help. No one comes. An hour and 40 minutes, the story was yesterday, and there were people, shot on the ground, and no one comes. No response for an hour and 40 minutes. So my point is that in trauma communities, mass trauma is sometimes more applicable than individual trauma. And my thing I wanted to just raise to you all, just for you to think about, is that conventional trauma response is based on individual response, not mass trauma. Tribal communities are often, when they declare those state of emergencies, it's normally because of some kind of mass trauma that has happened. The other thing is, like in any disaster, whether it's man-made or like a fire, hopefully not, but it just creates that sense of your safety shaken, your world's shaken, and you don't know. Everything becomes very unpredictable, and so you're kind of living with that uncertainty because you don't know if the other shoe's going to drop. You don't know what's going to happen next, and you don't know what kind of response you're going to get. You don't know who's going to really show up to help when you need it. So that's my main point I want to make and have you all think about. And that these presentations we do, they're not to try to provide detailed technical skills, because we only have a short time each month. It's just to kind of have you think about it and give you some additional resources to further your thinking. So the next slide is, so in tribal communities, in my experience, and perhaps in yours, there's this cascading effect of crisis that happens in some tribal communities. But we know that a crisis that happens in Indian country is never isolated to just one individual. It's never an individual. There's that person that's in crisis. Could be that the impact of unresolved generational trauma has piled up and can result in a behavioral health crisis. It could be that Native person in crisis, even though it looks like it's just one individual in crisis, maybe something's triggered them. Maybe there's some long kind of fermenting emotions that have been triggered. Sometimes against if it's a young person, sometimes it's emotions toward a parent or caretaker. And that goes deep, all of that generational trauma, all of that, the negative downside of Native people being discriminated against, and all of that, can be building up and create a behavioral health crisis. That's different than mainstream America. So the origin of crisis can be really different for tribal people. And the other flip side is that when, and these are examples that in Indian country, crisis is not just an individual. So on the flip side, if it's a young person in a behavioral health crisis, the parent or whoever's the adult in their life, it can help. It might trigger their own trauma, or it could create bad feelings in the parent or caretaker of feeling guilty that maybe they didn't, in their mind, maybe they didn't do what they thought they should do, and now look at their young person suffering. Even friends, cousins in Indian country, it's usually cousins or friends. It creates that cascading effect on them because they didn't know that their friend or their buddy or their cousin was in trouble, or maybe they knew but they didn't know what to say. So they didn't know how to intervene. So as that person kind of spirals down into a crisis, they too feel have bad feelings and self-doubt because they knew this might happen, but they didn't know what to say. They didn't intervene, so they feel guilty. And then the other cascading effect of crisis in tribal communities is you all know that news in tribal communities goes lightning fast through the community. And sometimes if there's a crisis, some people, step up, want to help. Some other people may think they just want to push that person away. They want to push that crisis away. They want to banish that person. So there's all kinds of reactions, and some of it comes from lateral violence, blaming each other. So there is a cascading effect of crisis in tribal communities. And I give those examples just to make the point that state of emergencies and crisis in tribal land is really never affects just one individual person. Oh no, it's a whole community or a whole family, or it affects a lot of people. So the next slide is an example of how communities respond. This is a picture from a resource I'm leaving with you all at the end, the Native Dads Network. And they're a really fabulous group. I would encourage you to look at their website. They are a grassroots organization in California, and I think I probably have spoken about them before. They respond to tribal crisis. They mobilize and they come together and they go into communities and tribal communities in crisis in California, and they bring ceremony, medicine. They de-escalate. They help de-escalate the situation by their presence as Native people and their ceremony and prayers and traditions that they bring into communities. So we have our own crisis responders for sure, and they're one example. So the next slide is, I want to share with you some information I thought was really interesting about preparing. How do you prepare for crisis response? And how do you prepare for mass trauma? So I have some examples I'm going to walk you through, which is comparing Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, which is a few years now, the crisis response that they had, and comparing that with tribal community crisis response. And you'll remember that the Charlottesville, what was going on there then, it was the white nationalists who and the counter protesters clashed over removal of Confederate statues in early August 2017. And so it was August 11th when they marched, the neo-Nazis, white nationalists marched, and you all have seen that many times on TV. And the counter protesters went nose to nose with them, and it was a terrible incident in every possible way. And the governor of Virginia declared a state of emergency the next day because it was just so out of control. There were some people that had lost their life, and it was a huge created a huge community crisis in Charlottesville, just the community that lived there. So I want to show you some examples of that, comparing that to tribal community crisis. But before I do, I wanted to share with you that I was hoping that I would be able to connect with our friends at Little Earth up in Minneapolis, but we weren't able to connect. But I'll still follow up and talk with them because I want to do another example of this same conversation I'm going to show you in a minute. But I want to use that of Charlottesville, I want to use Little Earth. And the reason I want to use Little Earth is when George Floyd was murdered, and you all remember that horrible disaster event, horrible. I don't know if you know, but Little Earth, which is the largest urban Indian housing community for Native people in the country, is just a few blocks away from the George Floyd murder. So, and you remember everything that happened after the George Floyd murder, the riots, the, incredible chaos that was going on there. So Little Earth swung into action. They swung into their own emergency response. And that's what I wanted to get more details from them so I could create a presentation about it. But they swung into action and they protected their community. The American Indian Movement folks that were there became like guards to, watch the perimeter of Little Earth so it didn't get violated and all this riot that was going on. So, but right now, I'm going to show you that comparison with Charlottesville because I didn't have all the information from Little Earth. But in the future, stay tuned. I'm going to do something about Little Earth and tribal community response. So if you can go to the next slide. Let me check on my time here. Better speed up. So on the left is steps that Charlottesville took after the neo-Nazi incident to address the community pain, the mass trauma that happened. And on the right is I compared it to from my experience, what I see in Indian country. So on the left, this is after the riots that Charlottesville, they had very limited mental health people and very limited emotional support services to help with that de-escalation. Indian country on the other side, same thing. Indian country, we have often have very limited mental health or emotional support services to help de-escalate. On the Charlottesville side, the third bullet is the whole town was just full of grief and anger, but there was no disaster recovery plan. There was no crisis counseling plan. There was no way everything was just, white hot with emotion. Indian country on the other side, same thing, right? When tragedies happen in Indian country and in our communities, the whole community convulses with grief and anger, and there's no disaster recovery or crisis counseling in place. So let's go on to the next slide. I have several of these slides and I'm not gonna be able to get through all of them, but you'll get them and you can read them later. So what they wanted to do in Charlottesville is professional counselors all got together and they tried to develop a community crisis response plan. And they already had full caseloads in general, and then they did this on top of it. So it was really a tough time. But let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that the Charlottesville folks talked about as they tried to recover from this mass trauma is they really struggled to organize. Same thing on the Indian countryside. It's a real struggle to organize. Charlottesville work, they had group meetings to do some initial crisis response planning, but the first meetings were taken up with just introductions and processing the trauma that they had all been through, and venting and crying and raging of how upset they were that this happened, that the white nationalists came into their community. On the Indian countryside, what I see, same thing, a real struggle to organize, in that when there's initial community meetings in reaction to a crisis, on the Indian countryside, it's taken up. Those meetings are with prayer, but the same thing, they're processing trauma, they're venting, and they're making space for tears and anger. Then the next slide is on the Charlottesville side of this chart. Their counselors, they had counseling staff that was available, but they didn't have any training on how to respond to mass trauma. Indian countryside, same thing. We have counseling staff, people, that are trained to help deal with white hot emotions, but they have very little training in responding to mass trauma. And that's my point. People in crisis response are trained on individual crisis response, not mass trauma. And I think in Indian country, mass trauma is really needs some serious attention. Let's go to the next slide. And the same thing happened both in Charlottesville and around in Indian country. Is in Charlottesville, their counselors were seriously on edge and just emotionally exhausted, and were just dealing with everything as much as they could, way beyond their regular hours. Of course, it wasn't about hours; it was about being part of the community and responding. Same thing happens on the Indian country side. That the community, the tribal leadership, any counselors, they're dealing with swirling cascade of information, and they're physically and emotionally exhausted, but they're there and they're doing everything they can. And it has nothing to do with 9 to 5, right? They're just there. And they have their own families that have been traumatized as well. So there's a lot of similarities. So next slide. So one of the things that Charlottesville folks did is they reached out to mass trauma specialists. They reached out to the Green Cross, those Red Cross. Green Cross is related to trauma. So they reached out to the Green Cross Academy of Traumatology that came and helped them think through and develop community crisis plans for mass trauma. Far as I know, in Indian country, which I don't know everything, so I could be wrong, we're not reaching out to the mass trauma response people, and maybe we will. Then the next slide. So the professional mass trauma people were very helpful to the Charlottesville folks, and I would hope that and would like to do whatever we can to help support this, that after tribes declare a state of emergency, that somehow we help share information with them on mass trauma response and help bring resources like the traumatology, the Green Cross, any resources that help. When you're in crisis, it's hard to think, right? It's hard to think straight. That's why the advantage of having folks that are very well trained in mass trauma can be helpful, because they can help suggest steps for the local communities to decide about what they want, how they want to move forward. The next slide, I have several more of these, so I'm really going to have to speed up here. So this is more examples. So if you can go to the next one, please. Just move to one more slide forward. Thank you. So it's just more examples of what the Charlottesville people did with the help from the Green Cross traumatology folks. And on the Indian countryside, what we tend to do is we'll reach out for our local behavioral health, tribal behavioral health, and sometimes ask for assistance for Indian Health Service. And then the next slide. So rehearsals. Rehearsals for mass trauma is really a good idea. It may sound kind of weird, but I think it's a really good idea. And what they found in Charlottesville is that rehearsing really provides structure, it provides guidelines. It's sort of like the terrible things that our children have to go through in schools. They have school drills for shooting events. They do these drills, right? Or like when I grew up in Oklahoma, there were tornado drills. Same thing for crisis in communities. To have some kind of rehearsal, some structure about what to do should something happen, who's going to be in charge, who makes the first calls, what's the public information that's going out, all of that really helpful to have that done in advance and to have rehearsals, to do it once in a while, not just create a plan and leave it. So go to the next slide, please. So here's the summary. I think, and maybe you all think this too, that tribal crisis planning is really important and that crisis response in tribal communities, I think it would be really helpful to focus on mass trauma and to look at mass trauma disaster response. You see that there's not a lot on mass trauma response, but a lot of it is in natural disaster response and disaster response in general. But I think it would be very helpful for tribal communities to really do some crisis planning from a mass trauma perspective. It helps the community feel safe because there's a plan. The leadership has a plan. It includes very predictable, responding to very predictable, the community-wide emotional response to crisis. It uses all of our brilliance and strengths to put into the plan. It's having a pre-crisis response strategy, super important. Just like in Oklahoma, it's like a severe weather warning, you know, when that happens, or when the sirens would go off about tornadoes, we knew what to do. And most importantly, it gives the sense of control back to the community. And so that's my main point I'm trying to make is two things. One is mass trauma resources, and the second one is crisis planning in advance of the crisis and periodically rehearsing that crisis. So the next slide, I think I'm just about done here. Yeah, takeaway points. So community engagement in engaging tribal leaders in preparing for crisis. Not that we want crisis. We're not trying to create crisis. We just should a crisis come up, we want to be prepared. It's a year-round process. There's a link to Native Dads Network. Oh, it should say Native Dads Network. And then FEMA has some guidelines on whole community approach to crisis planning. So you see, when I was looking for resources for you all, it was really where I found it was in the big disaster response resources like FEMA. And then there's another slide of takeaway points, I think. So it requires a systemic approach and maybe using resources like talking to the Green Cross people and becoming friends with them so that they can share their resources on how to put these plans together. And training in mass trauma training, really important. Very few people are trained in mass trauma, but why not? And even psychological first aid training is helpful, more common. Most people have been through psychological first aid. The next slide is one last takeaway point slide, then I think I'm done. So in Indian country, responding to community crisis involves many people with many different kinds of skills. It's traditional practitioners and clergy for prayer and ceremony. It's people having coffee and water and all the basic, things food to eat, blankets, medical care, transportation, aunties, grandmas, others, uncles for childcare, anything to provide comfort to the community, anything to relieve stress and provide needed support. But everyone can play a role in that. And maybe that's part of the mass trauma or crisis plan. The next slide is just the resources again. Okay, so there I listed Native Dads Network correctly. And I listed the Green Cross for you and the Association of Traumatic Stress Specialists, which is trauma training. And the next slide is, that's it. That's all I brought you today. So I hope you found this helpful. Again, thank you for the messages in the chat. I appreciate that very much. And I think trauma response is, well, I know it's a very big topic right now, and there's funding available for trauma response and crisis response, mobile crisis response, and other kinds of crisis response. And of course, the 988 lines in Indian country are growing, but I hope this helps you think about mass trauma and the importance of it, and the importance of tribal crisis planning in advance. So thank you all. It's always good to see you. That's it, Bernice.
Okay. So with the CEU information, don't forget to fill out the survey that was put in the chat. And also there's a link, a direct link here. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, bernice.jordan@uset.org, or Brian or Debiani as well. Next slide. So please join us next month, November 28th, for our topic, Listening to You. So it's the end of our 2023 series. So it's the last, it's going to be the fourth Tuesday, the last session of this year, held on the fourth Tuesday of the month. And then we'll be beginning again in January. Next slide. And one last thing, we still want to share our video with you. So when you're, when you're finished, thanks again for joining us. Go ahead, Debiani, and play this last video for everybody.
Indigenous people, shine your light, we are equal. I remember the days when our prayers were illegal. I remember the days when being Indian was lethal. Yeah, we had a rough past, but get ready for the sequel. You ready for the glorious comeback of our people? Oh, yeah. Rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. Nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's the time. Oh, nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's the time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's the time. With forgiveness as my bow and my prayers as my arrows, pull them back and let go. I watch them fly like sparrows. Have hope. Yeah, have hope. With compassion as my shield and faith down to my marrow, I will walk the pollen path even when it gets narrow. Yeah, I resurrect. Yes, you can bet that we seen the single mama raising children on the res. We seen domestic violence tear apart what we have left. We seen the alcohol take it all and leave us dead. We seen the children take their lives when they can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. Can't take the dread anymore. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war, but we've seen it all before. And now we know we can change it, 'cause that's why we were born. We know we are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the ones Grandma has been praying for. So rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up, wake up. Levántense, es nuestro tiempo. No tienes que esconderte más. Ahora es nuestro tiempo. Mujer indígena, tú eres tan sagrada. Traigas medicina de tu suelo todavía. A pesar del abuso de tu cuerpo y tu tierra, respetamos tus ancestros y la suya cultura. Hombre indígena, Tú eres honorable y yo veo la fuerza que todavía sobrevive a pesar del abuso de tu raza venerable. Yo respeto tus ritos, tus danzas, tus padres. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más.
They say that history is written by the victors. But how can there be a victor when the war isn't over? The battle has only just begun, and Creator is sending his very best warriors. And this time, it isn't Indians versus cowboys. No, this time, it is all the beautiful races of humanity together on the same side, and we are fighting to replace our fear with love. And this time, bullets, arrows, and cannonballs won't save us. The only weapons that are useful in this battle are the weapons of truth, faith, and compassion.
That was awesome. Lila June is really incredible poet, artist.
I did stop the recording, Deviani.
Hope to see you all next month.